Could you please talk a little bit to do the sound?
So all day long the noise of battle rolled amongst the mountains by the winter sea, until King Arthur's table, man by man, had fallen out of lioness about their lord King Arthur. And then, because I can go on like this for a couple of hours. Okay.
Dear Stalin, you may have heard that I have taken the job of financing a moving picture which the Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein is making in Mexico. It is going to be extraordinary work and will be a revelation of the moving picture art.
You have 20 days left on your visa, Mr. Eisenstein.
We have to bring this thing to an end.
What, Mr. Kimbrough, is this thing? What the hell does he know about film production?
I started my career rather optimistically, wishing to be a painter. And I was at art school in London in the very late 1950s, early 1960s. And most art schools would have had a film club, and I was president of the film club. And it was an autodidactic desire to learn as much about cinema. And almost by accident, I saw the classic Eisenstein film, The Battleship Potemkin, and I was amazed. Extraordinary film. You know, I was used to common English and American filmmaking, you know, very much as entertainment, which I didn't really pay that much attention to. But suddenly there was a filmmaker who was concerned about really big ideas and wasn't frightened about talking about Eros and Thanatos and, you know, the whole great sweep of political ideas, which were obviously relative to the Russian Revolution. And he, I think, also had a particular sort of poetic associational excitement about cinema as an art form. American cinema is basically about telling stories in a very sort of traditional way, illustration of the 19th century novel, beginnings, middles, and ends. And certainly in its infancy, I suppose, represented best by people like Griffiths with, you know, again, so-called big ideas like intolerance and so on, but somehow without a great sense of seriousness. But here suddenly was a filmmaker who was deadly, deadly serious and really meant what he said. And of course, I said, working in Russia at the beginning, indeed, of the 20th century, we know that Lenin was fascinated by cinema as notions of propaganda. And he felt, certainly Stalin likewise, because most of Russia were illiterate, they couldn't read or write, so the notion of expressing ideas through imagery was first-hand experience. But again, you know, I think like all great propagandists, and obviously Battleship Potemkin is a piece of propaganda, but then so is Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, a great piece of propaganda for Catholicism, but we don't accuse Michelangelo of being a propagandist. And I think really, really good propaganda always makes great art, and great art makes great life. So I think then through, I mean, I'm now 73, and I've had a long career as a filmmaker. I haven't actually sat down and sort of really researched him, but there have been lots and lots of opportunities of visiting film festivals around the world and constantly traveling to build up a huge body of information about this extraordinary man. There are 6 finished films, 3 at the beginning of his career, 3 at the end. There are lots and lots of aborted material. And he was a great teacher and a great lecturer, and he wrote a huge amount of stuff. And so I followed him in a curious way, not consciously, but maybe sort of, you know, semi-consciously. You know, I've been to Russia many, many times. I've been to all the places he's been to. I've certainly been to Mexico. So I've always admired this man as being, you know, cinema is 120 years old, isn't it? 1895 to 2015. So we've had 120 years of the possibilities of cinema. And a lot of it, you know, all comes back to this particular city here in Paris. You know, Bazin once upon a time said that cinema was a mixture of the theatre, literature, and if you're very, 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 very lucky, sometimes some painting. Because we've got a text-based cinema. We don't have an image-based cinema. The images are secondary. Cinema knows this because it always goes back to the bookshop. Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, supreme example. But Godard does the same thing. Almodovar does the same thing. I cannot go as a filmmaker, and indeed many filmmakers, they cannot go to a film producer or a studio with 4 paintings, 3 lithographs, a book of drawings and say, give me the money. Because most people are visually illiterate. They don't understand what an image is. Not necessarily their fault. It's the way we've organized our education around the world. You know, when you're a child aged 10, 11, 12, the teacher says, put away the crayons, put away the easel, stop painting now, get serious, learn text. You're going to pay the grocery bill and get your mortgage by text, not by image. We all live till 80 now. I don't know what the longevity rate is in France, but certainly generally in Western Europe. And so it means if you give up looking and studying and thinking and doodling and playing with imagery at 10, 70 years of your life are going to be bereft without the excitement of the extraordinary ability to see and to look. Rembrandt said, you know, just because you've got eyes doesn't mean to say you can see. And Derrida said the image always has the last word. And other people have said, you know, the notion of, you know, the Old Testament says in the beginning was the word. That's not true. In the beginning was the image. So I think we've now got a really boring text-based cinema. Every single film you have ever seen certainly started life as a text, and it pervades its meaning essentially through, again, illustrations of a textual motif, which is very, very largely 19th century. So it's back to Zola, and it's back to Dickens, and it's even back to Jane Austen. You know, where's James Joyce? Where's Perec? Where, if you're gonna base cinema on text, it's not even contemporary text, it's always a throwback. So I think, you know, we've had a very, very disappointing, I think certainly the last, probably the last 90 years of cinema have been very, very disappointing. And I think Eisenstein realized and Charlie Chaplin realized the big problem was sound movies. There's a way by introducing text, you let people off the hook. It's like when you visit the Louvre, you can see people wandering along the line of paintings and they're looking a little puzzled. What's this about? Don't understand what's going on here. And they lean forward and look at the title. Ah, Lady with a Red Parrot. That's what it's about. And they forget the image and they move on to the next one. We have no real intrinsic, I believe, essential association with the power of the representational image. Okay, we wander around the world and of course we're using our eyes. But there's a way in which the notion of the representational image, which means 8,000 years of European painting, okay, you know, we have extraordinary art books now, and more people are going to art galleries, but there still is that intrinsic value of the notion of the representational image. So I think, you know, we've really got to do something about it. And I try in my cinema to draw your attention to a very imagistic cinema. Text has so many ways to play with its meaning. We have this huge tradition of theatre which hands down its meaning essentially in words. For 400 years we've had the Western novel that plays with words. We've had long traditions of poetry going back to Homer which plays with words. Why can't we have a medium that really portrays its meaning essentially of ourselves and the world in image? So in a curious way, let me repeat, I think cinema has been very, very disappointing. And now we've ended up with cinema where people insist on going to the movies to be told a story. And that story is basically probably originally a text, which is probably purveyed better somewhere else anyway. So in a sense, you know, we've ended up with a cinema, I believe, of conductors and not composers. You need conductors, and some of them are very good, but they're not primary creators. So there are very, 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 very few primary creators in cinema. I think you can probably count them on the fingers of 2 hands. And for me, Eisenstein is number 1. He is the man. There were many, many filmmakers in the 1920s, beginning, you know, overground and underground. Overground, Griffiths, underground, Salvador Dali. Pushing a new vocabulary. And I think finally, in a way, you know, those great, great, great years of cinema as a visionary, prioritizing the image, really probably disappeared with the advent of sound cinema in 1929. And now we basically, you know, have a cinema which is bedtime stories for adults. Every now and again something comes along again, some film comes along that surprises and excites us and pushes the medium forward, but they're very, very rare. Scorsese makes the same films as Griffiths. What's the difference? The grammar and the syntax are still the same. Okay, publicity machine is much, much bigger. The equipment is extraordinarily more sophisticated than Griffiths ever used, but the actual language and grammar and vocabulary of cinema has hardly changed. That's very, very sad. If you think about what was happening in 1895 in literature, in music and painting, Van Gogh is painting in 1895, and now we have post-Andy Warhol and Jeff Koons. Strauss is writing in 1895 music for the Viennese opera, and now we're post-Boulez, we're post, well, you name it, who's your favorite? We're post-John Cage, we're post-John Philip Glass, etc., etc. So the huge vocabulary, many, many changes. And H.G. Wells is writing War of the Worlds in 1895, and now we're post-Perec and post, post James Joyce. So there's a way that all the other art forms have moved very fast and changed their language very dramatically, but cinema has remained rather boringly the same. I think, I have a great sense of optimism now that celluloid cinema is finished, but people still persist in making celluloid films. I think with a new technology, which is incredibly sophisticated, we ought to be putting new wine in new bottles, but we're still putting new wine in old bottles. Still getting and regurgitating the same boring old vocabulary. But it's an uphill task. I don't want to commit cinematic suicide. I want to be able to go on. And John Cage said, you really have to move at the member of the slowest infantryman. You still have to satisfy people to be telling them a story, so you still need plots and all that phenomena. But you want to be able to, I suppose is what I try to do, continually push forward. The medium is the message, the quality indeed of new technology and new languages. And in a curious way, try to educate the public. Look at this, look what you do with this, what you do with this, etc., etc., etc. And I think specifically the major talent of Eisenstein is as a film editor. The real gatekeepers of cinema always have been the editors, not the picture makers. And now I can do anything with any picture you make. I can change it, I can crop it, I can revalue it, I can metamorphize it, and so on. So the image maker, I think, has disappeared essentially. I mean, you still have to have raw material, but it's what the editor does with it. And I think that was Eisenstein's major talent, major cinematic brilliance. And he goes to Mexico and he tries to make a film. He shoots a huge amount of footage, but he's not allowed to edit it. So in homage, I've made, I think you'll agree, a very self-consciously edited film, which is constantly, look at the editing, look at the editing, look at the change of pace, look at the change of perspective, look at the way we use architecture, old and new. Look at the way we use color, look at the way we use grading. And we can do all these amazing things now, as I'm sure you know. And I suppose, the film certainly hasn't pleased the Russians, not only the homophobia, but the way we've tackled a mighty cinematic hero, which is very, very important for them. We haven't made a classical, in Russia biopic. We've actually taken Eisenstein out of Russia so he can see back to the persecuting word of Stalinism and such curious phenomena as dialectical materialism. I don't know what that means, and I don't think you do either. Or it's a word like postmodernism we can use in any context. And I think, basic fact, which we would all know when we go abroad, we become a different person, and we can look back at a different sort of perspective. And I think that frees up, his artistic sensibility, but it also frees up his sexual sensitivity too. And he begins to concern himself with what he probably believes himself to be. And he's still a sexual virgin at 33, which might sound strange in the 21st century, but I don't think we should be arrogant about that, because sex only began in 1963, didn't it? Sexual revolution, read Arthur Miller, read Philip Larkin. There's a way that, the invention of successful female contraception suddenly revealed an opportunity for sexual adventure, which never really existed before. It was basically sex within the confines of religious marriage was the only thing that was really permissible. So I think that, for all these sorts of reasons, certainly Eisenstein would be one of my cinematic heroes. I never ever thought ever of making a movie about him, but then I started going to Mexico, discovered this extraordinary beautiful city, which is a silver mining town called Guanajuato, with these extraordinary catacombs underneath where they took the silver from. And I began to realize the correspondence that was coming out of Russia. Every now and again, sort of Brezhnev and Gorbachev, the archives open, and you start learning new things. And there was this big correspondence by letter, of Eisenstein sending letters back to Moscow to his secretary, a woman called Vera Tasheva. You can go to Moscow and you can read these letters, this correspondence. To do it in letter form in the film was somewhat clumsy, so we turned them into telephone conversations. Vera Tasheva was certainly in love with Eisenstein, but there was no way he was going to reciprocate that. Eventually they did marry, but I think that was a marriage of convenience to hide his homosexuality, because I think after 1933, Stalin brought down homophobic laws, which meant you would probably be poisoned, shot, locked up, or sent to Siberia if you're accused of sodomy. So it's a sort of protective thing. But the evidence, indeed, of Eisenstein's affair with Palomina Komedo is all written out there, and you can go and read it if you want to. So it's nothing that I've invented. But I think if you examine his films, which are full of naked soldiers and guns going off, there's a way that the subtext is already there. And it's interesting, isn't it, that cinema was supposed to be invented in the Christmas here in this city in 1895. And 6 weeks earlier, Freud produced his first paper on female hysteria. So psychoanalysis and cinema have grown up together. And American cinema now is very much Californian concern for post-Freudian examination of the psychological character. Occasionally you will see a naked person in American cinema, but what you have and what they concentrate on is this notion of psychoanalytical analysis. Take all the recent successes. Take Birdman, for example. This is all about the same thing. And I think, the cinema is so much more powerful, so much more amazing, and now it has such an extraordinary vocabulary. I'd like to think that maybe the 120 years we've had so far, if you want to call it cinema, is only a prologue. It's us adjusting the language, trying to find out how to use it. I would argue that maybe the very first masterpiece was, in fact, Eisenstein's Strike, which he made when he was 25 years old, incredibly young to have made such an extraordinary movie. And it took a whole generation, 1895 to 1925, to be able really to begin to understand how extraordinary cinema was. And I think the inklings of that, or what it could be, was certainly relative to that extraordinary film called Strike. And then I think 18 months later he then made Potemkin, which was an enormous shock to the world. Charlie Chaplin was amazed by the film, along with Douglas Fairbanks, and there was a way that Paramount Pictures sent out people to Moscow saying, this guy has to come to Hollywood to make a movie. Stalin was happy to send him because it's 1929 and Russia wanted to learn about sound cinema. That was the excuse. Not that I think Tissé was a real, I suppose, cinematic nerd, was really fascinated by the equipment and the language in a technological way. But I think Vertov going to Berlin was more valuable for Russia to understand sound cinema than ever Eisenstein in Hollywood. But anyway, that was a good excuse, and he was indeed in the West for 3 years, 1929, 1930, 1931. Total failure in Hollywood, but that might have been Eisenstein's fault as well. Could have been quite a difficult person to work with. I think they came up with about 25 different ideas for the 18 months he lived in Hollywood, but it was unsuccessful. There was a big stock market crash and then a depression. So in the end, they said goodbye to Eisenstein. He'd become associated with a whole series of socialists in America. I know American socialism sounds a bit like contradiction. Even the word socialism now terrorized contemporary Americans. I think the worst insult they can throw at Obama is to call him a socialist. So he meets people indeed like Paul Robeson, who was a communist, and certainly Charlie Chaplin was, and they all had friends in Mexico. I suppose, Mexico was a bit like the American playground. Probably very, very badly behaved Americans in Mexico. And there still is a sort of trivialization of Mexico. Consider how badly they treated, Mexico in the wars in the Mexico, etc., etc. But anyway, it was suggested that Upton Sinclair, American socialists, would try and provide the money for Eisenstein at least to make a documentary before he went back to Russia with his tail between his legs. And that again was a disaster. And I began, as I suggested, to visit Mexico, saw this extraordinary town, read the letters, and decided the time was right to pay my homage to Eisenstein. We ended up with a film. And now I think the film has been, on the whole, very extremely well received, and I've found a brilliant actor to play the part, and I want to go on. So we're now going to make a trilogy. Eisenstein in 1929, on his way to America, stayed in a place called La Sarraz in Switzerland, where the very, very first film festival ever was held. And of course, Eisenstein dominated the arguments. The arguments then, as is now, is basically, can we consider cinema to be commercial entertainment, or is it an art form? The jury is still out. Happily, we can still talk about this, and we'll talk about it forever. And then, of course, he went to Hollywood, and we now have a script called Eisenstein in Hollywood, so these will be parts 1 and 2, of which the Mexican film will be part 3. We have most of the money already. People have rushed to be able to fund these projects, and we hope to be shooting probably in Switzerland, and probably in California around about next Christmas. So the game will continue.
10 days that shook the world.
I shall consider these 10 days as the 10 days that shook Eisenstein.